Northeastern University criminologist James Allen Fox on the recent decline in mass shootings. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of the reload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective that focuses on hard news and analysis. This week, we are going to be talking about the lack, it's good news, another good news episode. We had a good news episode last week. The lack of mass shootings we've seen this year so far. And to do that, we're speaking with Professor James Allen Fox, who is a criminologist with Northeastern University. Welcome back to the show, Professor. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, and before we get going, can you just tell people a little bit more about yourself for anyone who may not have listened to the previous episode? It's been a little while since we've had you on.
Sure. Well, I've been at Northeastern for 48 years, and over 40 of those years, I've been studying mass murder, both serial killing and mass shootings and school violence and the like. I managed the Associated Press, USA Today, Northeastern University Mass Killing Database, which is a comprehensive database of all incidents where 4 more people are killed. Since 2006, dozens and dozens of variables. Written 18 books, including 6 of them on mass killing, the most recent of which was Extreme Killing, Understanding Serial and Mass Murder, which came out a year ago. I also write columns frequently. I know you contacted me because of my Washington Post column from a week ago, but I've done over 300 over the years on various topics of violence and murder.
Yep. So needless to say, you have studied this topic very closely for a very long time.
Yes.
And written profusely about it, including your most recent Washington Post column, which is sort of the impetus for why I wanted to have. I mean, I've been was hoping to have somebody on to talk about this because it is a phenomenon that is not getting a lot of attention, which is something you talk about in your piece. We kind of only focus on this topic in the aftermath of a terrible mass shooting. And when there's been a lull, we don't, it doesn't get as much attention. Similar to what I was talking about last week with the murder rate, murder gets talked about a lot when it's getting worse and not so much when it's getting better. So, it's certainly important to check in on these things regardless of whether they're getting worse or better. And when they're getting better, it might be a good idea to try and understand why, right? So to that end, do you have, it's interesting to me when I look at the situation, because we're seeing this decline in the murder rate, these your regular, this is a terrible way to put it, but your more, common types of murders are going down. And at the same time, we're seeing fewer of your mass killings, or at least the sort of mass shootings that garner a lot of attention in media. And so it might be natural to say, well, maybe they're connected. Maybe there's the one is driving the other or something along those lines. It seems to me from reading your piece, you don't feel that way. What do you think is happening?
Well, it's a short-term decline, but it is a substantial decline. It's a substantial decline following the worst year that we've had in terms of mass shootings, which was 2023. And when things spike like they did that year, the tendency is for the numbers to go back down the following year. I call it criminological gravity. And what goes up must come down. But the thing is that there was not a peep about it in the press. There's an old expression that no news is good news. It's really good news is no news, and bad news is big news. When we had a couple of years ago a relatively slight increase in mass shootings, it was a major story. It was a couple percentage points, major story, leading all sorts of statements about an epidemic of mass shootings. But what we saw in 2024 over 2023 was a 24% decline in mass shootings. And this year, compared to last year at the same point in time, another big drop. Mass shootings of former people injured or killed are down this year by a third. And mass killings by gunfire, which at this time last year were 11, now they're down to 4. So it's a substantial drop, but it's only over for 17 months. And I hate to declare a trend on a relatively short period of time because the numbers could bounce back up when you talk about relatively few. But it's still good news, and no one knows about it because it has not been reported. And I think that's an important issue, is the press really should be paying attention when we see, I would say it's good news, it's less bad news. That's an important point, because when it goes up slightly, there's headlines. When it goes down a lot, there's nothing.
Yeah, it is a noticeable issue in the industry for sure. And, it may just be a lot of this, people blame the media, and that's fair. But it also is sort of media consumption. People tend to pay more attention when there's big, flashy, bad news than when there's, something bad didn't happen. Doesn't maybe not get as much attention.
Sure. Like we almost every night on the national news, we have stories about bad weather, hurricanes, tornadoes, storms. When there isn't any bad weather, they don't come on the news and say, "Hey, there's been no bad weather today." They don't do that, of course. They're only there to report bad things. When bad things don't happen, there's not a report.
It's sort of also an issue just with human nature of what people want to pay attention to. But I agree with you that it is important to note what these trends and try to understand them, regardless of whether they're good or bad. Sometimes it's nice to talk about a good trend for once.
But I will say that I think, if 24 over 23, a 24% drop, you would have thought that there'd be some news reporting on that. No, it wasn't.
Yeah. And, we've gotten into some of the definitions here a little bit. And obviously that's one of the controversies in this whole field is how do you define these things? With the Reload, we tend to look more towards what would be the strictest definition is the Violence Project, which is 4 more killed, but also in a public, in an event that's not connected to some other kind of crime, like drug-related crime. You guys, there's the most. I think the most expansive definition is kind of the one that gets the most attention, which is the Gun Violence Project, which is just 4 more injured. Yeah, right.
The Gun Violence Archive.
Yeah, sorry, Gun Violence Archive. We've talked to them as well on the show before, but that's going to get you a lot more incidents caught in that definition, certainly. And but you guys with the database that you run with the Associated Press and USA Today, you kind of take a more holistic approach. You kind of try to include a lot of different definitions so people can go through it on their own. What can you just explain your approach to that?
Well, we use the traditional threshold, which is 4 or more people. I do know that, for example, that Mother Jones switched from 4 to 3 when Congress passed a law back in 2013 that arbitrarily said, well, mass shootings are 3 people or more killed. So they switched. Unfortunately, they didn't go back and fill in the cases of 3 people killed in their earlier data, which has led a number of analysts to claim a big surge using their data when, in fact, it was just because you lower the threshold, the numbers go up. So we use the 4 or more killed. Now, as far as the issue of killing versus injuring, death is different. I mean, sure, injuries can be debilitating. They often are, but they can also be minor. So there's a whole range of what is an injury, but there's not a range of death. So we've used this definition of former people killed goes back decades to the 80s when I started using it, when the FBI was using it. It was only happened in 2013 when the Gun Violence Archive and Mass Shooting Tracker, they basically said, well, there's nothing in the term mass shootings that says people have to die. So, I respect and use the Gun Violence Archive data. And it gets a lot of press, as you say, because, big numbers seem more important. And when you have over 600 in a year, almost 2 a day, that's a headline grabber. One of the problems there, if I may, is that sometimes people get confused between a mass killing, lots of deaths, and a mass shooting where there's no deaths. In fact, half of the Gun Violence Archive cases have no deaths. And 3/4 have either 0 or 1. The problem is when you have a big, let's say, for example, the massive shooting in Maine in 2013, 18 people killed, newspapers would report along with that as sidebar information or context that there've been hundreds of mass shootings. Well, those aren't like the ones that happened in Maine. It's like mixing up grapefruits and grapes. Yeah. And that confuses people.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been my critique of it. That's why I've always preferred the Violence Project count. Yeah. I mean, it's not perfect either, because sometimes you'll get incidents where 3 people are killed in a very similar situation to one where 4 people are killed, but it doesn't make it into the tracker. And also it focuses exclusively on shootings, right? Where we're talking about this so far, and there haven't been any mass shootings that qualify for the Violence Project, and there haven't been any what you would term public mass shootings. But there has been a public mass killing this year, right? It's in your tracker because you guys go beyond just shootings, and that would be the New Orleans attack at the beginning of the year.
Sure, 19% of mass killing don't involve guns as the primary weapon. New Orleans is an example. Another example would be the mass stabbing of the 4 students at the University of Idaho, because that gets a lot of publicity. Come to co-eds and students and so forth, but that's the only database that has that case is ours, because we say if people are killed by strangulation, stabbing, truck ramming, they're just as dead, and sometimes they even suffer more painful deaths than a shooting. So why don't those count? They do count. Obviously, if you use our database, you can separate the shootings from the non-shootings if you wish. But those people are just as dead. And I will say that I understand the Violence Project's focus on public, because those are the ones that scare people, because they can happen at any time, at any place, to anyone, without warning. Whereas 45% of mass killings and mass shootings are within the family, in a private residence. Those don't scare people because they say, well, it's not my family. And they don't tend to get the same level of publicity either. But they're just as dead. So in our way of thinking, if 4 people die as homicides, that matters. Now, there are cases where 4 people are dead, but it's a murder-suicide. 3 victims killed, perpetrator committing suicide. We don't include that.
Yeah, and I guess, first off, just so people are aware, your tracker has at least 5 of those so far this year.
4.
And like you said, that ends up being nearly half of all mass killings.
And I'll say it's 4 this year. The Gun Violence Archive includes a 5th that happened recently, but by appearances, and I've talked to the police there, it's not really mass shooting. It's probably a murder-suicide.
Yeah.
And
one of them was...
we won't include it until we know.
One in your count was a stabbing as well. So it's not like there's mass violence has disappeared. It's just, it's certainly the kind that we tend to focus on a lot in America. We haven't seen as many of those.
Right.
And it is interesting. It's interesting to have these conversations, because it's like, well, why do you draw the line in a certain spot right? And then why, what does it look like when you count things in different ways? And one thing I will say, though, this year is clearly all of these counts have gone down, right? The gun violence archives count is also down. It's much higher than the other counts, but it's still down from what it had been.
By a third over last year.
So there
Went
seems
from
to be
170 last year to 115 this year.
So, it seems to be a trend that's captured by all of these counts, regardless of which one you look at. One violence project's at 0. You guys are a little higher than that, and then gun violence archive is higher than that. Mother Jones does the 3 or more, but they also filter out incidents that aren't in public and don't don't have anything to do with crime.
So there've been no public mass killings this year, and last year there were 3.
Yeah,
as opposed to 10 in 2023, which is the most ever. The average number of public mass killings by gunfire, the ones that the Violence Project focuses on, and we have that classification too, we average about 6 a year. Now, people talk about the increase. Well, if you go back decades, we had about 2 a year, and now we average about 6 a year. It tripled, but it's from 2 to 6. And by the way, some of that increase is because the population increased by 50% over that period of time. So it's not an epidemic. I mean, that term is used so loosely. And let me make this point important. So several years ago, I did a podcast for another organization. And it was all about mass shootings. And the host tweeted out that James Allen Fox, expert on mass shootings, says there's no evidence of an epidemic. Well, that was retweeted by then, the 45th president, Donald Trump was president then. He retweeted it, which increased my number of followers by about thousands. But that maybe he retweeted because it meant, well, we don't have to do anything about guns because it's not an epidemic. But that wasn't my point. Even though it's not an epidemic, it's still a problem. People are still dying. So I don't want to, people oftentimes misread when I say not an epidemic by saying we shouldn't worry about it. Yes, we should worry about it because we still have many more than our share. Our research has shown that the United States population has about 4% of the world population. And we have approximately 20% of mass shootings. So
Right. It's not to say that there's no problem, that people shouldn't work to try and solve this issue.
Right.
It's just about properly explaining it to people what's actually happening. Because and I'm this has been my critique of a lot of the gun violence archive count, and I don't think counting those incidents is a problem. I think the way that it gets talked about can be problematic because, like, as you said, you're conflating something like Parkland or Maine with with gang shootings that occur. And then that doesn't mean that gang shootings where people get injured are acceptable or okay, but they're very different problems. Right. The same thing for, family side, where somebody murders their family. Mm-hmm. It's obviously a horrendous issue, but it's a different problem, maybe a related problem, but different from somebody who goes out in public and kills people at random.
And the problem with and this is not their fault, but the problem with the numbers in the gun violence archive is it takes some work to figure out what percentage of those cases were gang related or are family massacres. You have to download the data. You have to do all sorts of searches and criteria. With ours, there are 3 we have 3 websites, basically. AP has a website, USA Today has a website, and the Washington Post also, which has adopted our data, also has a website. It's very easy. For example, you can filter the data with a single click on these websites to look at it. If you only want to look at public, you choose public. And it'll show you the map, it'll show you the trend lines, all sorts of stuff. If you want to look at family related, just click that. So we made it very easy to distinguish the different types of mass killings.
Right. Yeah, which I think makes it easier to have a better understanding of what's going on, and which is key to informing people about the entire situation. So, we are seeing this decline. Now, it seems just as there isn't necessarily an epidemic where, this is accelerating at, an unprecedented pace. It sounds like you aren't convinced that we are necessarily seeing a lasting decline here.
We may. We may. It's just,
okay.
I have a degree in statistics besides my criminology degree. And
right.
I'm just very wary of declaring a trend on a relatively short period of time. This happened back in the 90s when John DiIulio and I independently talked about the youth homicide problem. And he used the word super predator, which I never liked. I talked about it at the calm before the crime storm, and I worked with the White House and the Justice Department and Janet Reno and produced these forecasts of what would happen if present trends continue. Well, they didn't continue. So as soon as the ink was dry on the report to the Attorney General, things started turning around. Now, I don't apologize for that. DiIulio has. I don't apologize because I think people did something about it. I'm not necessarily did the right thing. I was always pushing for prevention programs, and Congress in their, I think, lack of wisdoms pushed for prison construction and trying kids as adults. But still, the numbers did go down.
Yeah. And so, you're not convinced yet that this is
I'm hopeful.
A sustainable trend or something that we can look at and say things have turned a corner here. Yep. It's just we're still in the early stages of this.
Yes.
And there's no saying that it's going to continue on this path.
We don't know, but I am hopeful.
Right.
The fact.
So what makes you hopeful, I guess, would be the next question.
Well, 24 and 24 were basically brought things back to where they were after 2023. And the fact that it's continuing this year and through almost 5 months is a very good sign that it maybe just wasn't a 1 year aberration. But I worry about it being a 2 year aberration. So let's not declare victory yet. But certainly fewer people are dying, fewer people being shot, and that's excellent news. Let me take a turn for a moment for something.
Sure.
The other area in which there's so much misunderstanding is school shootings. What is a school shooting? Now, the K through 12 school shooting database talks about 350 school shootings a year. And I've broken all those numbers down. And 9% of them occurred in school. Right. 91% occurred at school, meaning on the school grounds. And oftentimes at 11 at night, weekends, summer, not involving students at all. So I think it's important to understand what is a school shooting by that database. Every Time for Gun Safety also has a database where you also look at the same thing, that when you take the numbers and whittle them down, you find that the vast majority of shootings on school property are on the property, not in the school. And the reason why this is important is these numbers tend to fuel efforts to have more and more active shooter drills in schools, armed guards, surveillance systems, locking classroom doors. The thing is that those strategies are not relevant for the overwhelming majority of school shootings because they're not in the school.
Right.
So I think that's another area where there's lots of misunderstanding and hand-wringing and poor responses because of fear.
Yeah, I think it's an even more difficult situation with school shootings because there's an even less agreed upon definition. I mean, it's just kind of a shooting that occurs at a school can be a school shooting, right? Unlike when you look at mass murder and there's some background from the FBI or from DOJ on what should constitute a mass murder. There really isn't anything like that for school shootings. You can just kind of call any shooting that happens on a school shooting. But obviously, most people are not thinking of, an accidental discharge from even from an SRO, a school resource officer, as a school shooting, even though it is technically a shooting that happened at a school. Most people are thinking of, the something like Parkland when you talk about a school shooting, or even a less devastating one. One that affects kills fewer people would still be considered a school shooting. But
the FBI active shooter database, the average number of active shooters in school is 2 a year, and that's out of 130,000 schools. And by the average number of students who are killed in school a year is 5. 5 students on average. Obviously, when 2018, you had Parkland and Santa Fe, and of course, 2012 we had Sandy Hook, and 2023 we had Uvalde. The numbers spike, but the average is 5, and that's out of 50 million school children, which basically says that the likelihood that your student is going to get killed in school by an armed assailant is 1 in 10 million. Now, again, I don't want to minimize, and 1 is one too many.
Certainly.
But compare it to the fact that there are hundreds and hundreds of school-age children who drown in pools every year. What we really need is more lifeguards at pools, maybe not armed guards at schools.
Yeah, and it does, this sort of focus on these things and misunderstanding about them drives people to be much more concerned than might make sense from this, an honest reading of the statistics. And it's understandable why, right? I mean, people are going to be worried about their children. It can happen at any school, but it's extremely rare. Just same for mass shootings in practice, they can happen anywhere. And so that's very scary, but they are extremely rare in reality, not as rare as we want them to be, certainly. And hopefully we'll see fewer of them if this trend continues. But yeah, I mean, it's all about trying to give people a full understanding of what's actually happening out there. So as to, so they can have a proper estimation of what the risk actually is in these things. Because schools in reality are some of the safest places for children to be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. They're more at risk in the after school hours when parents aren't home and they're out at the mall, the playground. Bad things tend to happen there. While they're in school, they have supervision and structure. Yeah.
Of course, those are much more, pools and playgrounds are much more mundane risks. They're, it's not as, children die more frequently in those locations, but because
to the parents, it doesn't matter whether the kid drowns or shot.
Right.
To the community, it does. It's the impact of the community, or even the nation, when there's a shooting at a school. And of course, we had the one in Georgia last year, where 4 students were killed. Yep. That has a devastating impact. If kids drown, it doesn't have the same impact on the psyche of Americans.
Yeah, and I think the rarity of it is part of that. It's not as common of a thing to hear about, and still preventable, and so people focus a lot more on those, and more gruesome as well. Obviously, more it's a horrible scene at a school shooting than a pool drowning. But to get off a little bit of this morbid streak here, what do you see any initiatives that have happened over the last couple of years that you think are maybe contributing to? Is there evidence that we've seen in the data that suggests some of these efforts we've put in place, across the political spectrum, whether it's red flag laws or higher security or loosening concealed carry restrictions, those sorts of efforts that we've seen? Is there evidence that any of those are contributing to this, or mental health funding, that kind of thing?
Well, my colleagues and I have done research on public mass shootings state by state, looking at various state laws. We looked at about 11 different laws. See what is related to the rates of mass shootings state by state, because most gun laws are state level. And we did find two that actually have a significant effect. One is states that have permits to purchase requirements, which of course is a much more detailed background check than the NICS system, the federal system. And a permit purchase state like Massachusetts, even things that don't result in a conviction or even an arrest may be a red flag for saying, no, you're not a good person for a permit. States that have permit to purchase laws have significantly lower rate of mass shootings. And then states that have bans on large capacity magazines, there's about 11 states that do, those states have significantly fewer casualties, deaths and injuries when there is a mass shooting. So there are things that have shown to work. Now, red flag laws, the curious thing there is that every red flag law that exists in this country has been motivated in the wake of homicide, typically mass killings, mass shootings. And most of them actually were implemented after Parkland. The research that's been done that shows the impact of red flag laws has been on suicide. Good research, basically looking at suicide rates before and after implementation of red flag laws. And some people say, see, they work. Yeah, they do work for suicide. We don't know if they work for homicide. It's a very different kind of thing. And I was worried if these laws aren't implemented with the proper level of protections and rights to those who are the focus of the red flag law. You have people homicidal, you take their gun away or attempt to take their gun away. There are other weapons in the house. So I just have to understand that suicide and homicide are different. So I'm hopeful that the expansion of red flag laws will have an effect on homicides and mass shootings in particular. We just don't know yet.
Mm-hmm. So for you, the answer is permit to purchase laws and magazine limits.
Yes.
What
so
limit did you guys use for that? Because that's one of the, it varies significantly state to state.
Yeah. Well, it was just with states that do
just
limit. Usually 10 is sort of the typical. But any state that did limit the size of the magazines were included in that analysis.
Were you able to look at the mass shootings in particular to see if the perpetrators had used smaller magazines? Or was this just, more of a broad level review of it?
Well, we had the rates.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so we did, obviously, we had 4 or more with the number killed.
Right.
And if the state had one or didn't have one, that was the independent variable in that case.
Okay. So it wasn't you weren't able to go in and look at the actual individual incidents to see if they had used different size magazines or what have you.
Right.
Because what is the theory there? I guess that they have to stop to reload more often?
Yeah, basically the requirement to reload, which obviously creates a pause, even though it may be a short pause, it's still a pause, and giving up ability for people to escape or attack the perpetrator themselves.
Interesting. And you think the permit to purchase one, you mentioned the idea that it's a more rigorous process to get a firearm as opposed
for example, in my state, Massachusetts, where to get a permit, you have to basically apply to the local police department. Now, the local police department would know if there's been lots of call for domestic violence concerns of that household, for example. Mm-hmm. That wouldn't necessarily disqualify someone federally, if there'd been no arrest.
Right.
But the police will know, that person there, we don't trust them with a gun, so they wouldn't give the permit.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that raises the same sort of concerns that you mentioned with the red flag issue of people, people's rights and the idea that they could use a different weapon. But okay, all right. Well, we don't want to. We don't need to totally litigate these things. I know, but there's obviously there's a lot of disagreement over what works and what doesn't work. I have seen. I think Rand had similar findings, maybe citing some of your work, I think, actually. But, is there anything else beyond gun control measures that you see as potentially helpful to reduce?
Well, let me say something about you brought up mental illness. Most mass shooters, by the way, are not mentally ill. They're not happy, obviously. But
they're going through like a mental health spiral is what
they may.
They the Violence Project, that's one of the main things they talk about.
They see themselves as the victims of injustice. They see themselves as the good guy trying to get even with the people they blame for their problems. I recall very vividly back after Sandy Hook when Barack Obama went to Hartford and gave a speech and said, we need to do something about the mentally ill before it's too late. Now, why? Is it so we're so concerned about the well-being of the mentally ill? Or are we concerned about the well-being of the people they may shoot? I think it's the latter, which really, by focusing on by this idea that mass shooters and mental illness is the same thing, conflating the two, intensifies the stigma associated with being mentally ill. But most mass shooters are not. It takes a certain degree of clear-headedness to carry out a kind of bloodbath. And some people who are severely mentally ill just aren't capable of that kind of planning and execution. So, for example, the Columbia University database, the percentage of mass shooters who are mentally ill, seriously mentally ill, I can't remember the exact numbers, around 13%. Relatively rare.
Right. It's usually more of a mental health crisis where somebody is spiraling, and there's the Violence Project talks at least a lot about the idea of off ramping, and so maybe mental health services can help somebody even if they're not like diagnosably mentally ill in some way.
We have to be careful. The Violence Project database, and I've looked at all the cases. I was involved as an expert witness in the lawsuit following the Sutherland Springs shooting in Texas. And there, the plaintiffs were citing the gun violence, the Violence Project numbers of 30-some-odd% being mentally ill. I looked at all those cases, and unfortunately, a lot of the cases it wasn't a diagnosis, it wasn't anything official. It was just neighbors said, "Oh yeah, the guy was nuts."
Right.
Or sometimes things like with abuse, the abuse was a guy at a shopping mall yelling at his wife. So we had to be really careful about qualifying what we mean by mental illness. Someone who's depressed, who lost their job, that's not mental illness. They're just upset. Right. They're angry and unhappy, and they feel hopeless.
Yeah.
Now,
there's a difference between serious mental illness and a mental health crisis. Right.
Now, do I believe that we should do something about improving access to mental health services? Yes. The problem is Congress doesn't talk about that, except when we've had a mass shooting, and that goes back to the stigma associated with being mentally ill. Oh, you're a likely mass killer. We should improve services, mental health services, because there are millions of Americans who could benefit. Will it prevent mass shootings? Well, I'm not so sure, because the thing about mass shooters, they don't think there's anything wrong with them. They think the problem is everybody else. The wife doesn't understand them. The wife kicked them out of the house. The boss didn't give them the right kind of assignments or raises. They're not going to, if you say, well, here, you go to this counselor. They'll say, hell no, I don't need a counselor. Maybe you need a counselor, not me. The kind of treatment they want is fair treatment, not psychological kind. So it sounds great. Let's say better mental health services, and we should. But I don't expect that's going to take a major bite out of mass shootings. It will affect some, prevent some, absolutely. And we should have it. But that's not the reason we should have it. The reason we should have it because lots of Americans can benefit.
Fair point. All right. Well, look, we appreciate you joining us here at the Reload again to give us your insight on this, especially to talk about what has been, a good, like I think you said, like 18 months, something like that so far. Hopefully this trend will continue and we can have you back on to discuss this further. More good news. Maybe focus more on the explanation for why it might be happening next time.
Maybe at the end of the year, let's see what happens by the end of 2025.
Yeah.
It will be lower. I don't see a big spike coming, but it'd be nice to have 2 years, full 2 years of data.
It would be. So yeah, maybe we'll have to have you back on either way just to see what exactly happened.
And can I say one more thing about the media?
Yeah.
It's really unfortunate that the media will often conflate the mass shootings that have no fatalities, or maybe one, with the ones that lots of people die. A great example is a couple of years ago, the New York Times did an article with the headline. It was in May of a couple of years ago, I forget which year, off the top of my head. They said, as of the headline was a partial list of mass shootings thus far this year. And there were 13 on the list. Every one of those 13 was a mass killing with at least 4 dead. They were all the mass killings so far that year. But in the article says, there are many more that are not in that list. the many more weren't like that. But they didn't say that. They didn't say, well, there's many more with fewer than 4 killed. They didn't say that. They just let the reader misunderstand, think, oh, these 13, those are terrible. There's many more. Yep. Can't name them because those are the only 13 of them. Mass killings.
I think that's a serious problem in the industry. Because the ones that get coverage, right, are the mass killings.
Yes.
As you described, these public mass killings, and specifically public mass killings, not the family side. That does not get nearly as much attention, certainly not on a national level. Public mass killings do. And then very commonly, when covering the public mass killings, they will bring up most of the time the gun violence archive number, which is in the hundreds. And the implication will be this happens 100 times. But they don't cover the other ones because they don't happen as frequent. Because the reality is that the public mass killings aren't as frequent as the other kinds of shootings. And they aren't as interesting to audiences. I guess they're not as shocking. They may be bad and a serious problem in the country, but they don't garner the same attention. And I think it is misleading for exactly the reasons you laid out. It gives people the impression that something like Parkland or Las Vegas happens all the time, hundreds of times a year, and it's not true.
Right. I agree.
Yeah. So anyway, we appreciate you coming on.
We also need a public that's more critical of the news that they read or watch.
Yes.
And I don't think people are.
Yeah, I mean, it is somewhat like I said, there's a reason that news media covers things this way. And it's not just because they may be misinformed or whatever, or they don't want to cover good news. It's often that people don't pay attention to the good news, right? That's reality. Right. What gets covered in part is driven by what gets attention. Right.
But I will say, several years ago, the Gun Violence Archive, when they reported the number of fatalities, they included the perpetrator with the number. Mm-hmm. And I saw lots of news stories that had the number of victims wrong because they misunderstood that the person who commits suicide is not a victim. Fortunately, they changed. They then made a revision where they separated out. And with the school shootings, I remember did a piece years ago when every time for gun safety had the term school shootings, and they included shootings that weren't in the school but on the school property. Fortunately, they changed and they renamed it shootings on school property or school grounds.
Right.
So I think it's very important. The language is very important, in how this is reported so as
Yes.
not to confuse the public.
Yes.
And that's why we have this surveys show that a level of fear is, that's where the epidemic is. As many as 30% of people say they avoid certain places because they're afraid of being gunned down in a mass shooting.
Yeah. And parents often, when you ask them their expectation for whether or not there will be a shooting at their child's school, the numbers are very high, when in reality, as you mentioned earlier, the incidents are exceedingly rare, as bad as they are. Again, it goes back to your point. Like, the point here is not that there's no problem. The point is to make sure people have a correct understanding of the problem, and that they're different problems, right? These aren't all the same issue. But look, I appreciate you coming on. I know I took up, I think, more time than we were supposed to go. So I appreciate you giving us this much of your time. But for people who want to follow your writing, maybe pick up your book, where can they do that? Well,
of course, Amazon has all my books. Or better yet, my website, jamesalanfox.com. It's JAMESALANFOX.com. You'll find all my columns there. You'll find links to books. You'll also find videos of my presentations.
All right, wonderful. That's a great resource for people who want to keep up to date with what's going on with you. Thanks again for coming on. We'll have to have you on in the future to figure out where these trends head in the long run. But that's all we've got for you guys this week. We will see you all again real soon.